They called my sons the dumb ones. Not in hushed voices. Not in the privacy of a kitchen conversation where shame could at least pretend to live. They said it the way people say pass the salt, casually, without weight, without even the dignity of cruelty. Just a fact. A label. A verdict handed down before the jury had even been seated. My twins were 18 years old. Leo had a laugh that could crack open a room. He collected mechanical watches, took them apart on the kitchen table, rebuilt them from memory. He had never once gotten a B in shop class. He understood systems the way some people understand music, intuitively, physically, in his bones. Adrian read slowly. He always had. Words scrambled on him, letters traded places, sentences arrived in pieces. But he remembered everything he heard. Every conversation. Every number. Every pattern buried in a spreadsheet that everyone else had given up on. His memory was not just good. It was architectural. But they struggled in school. They did. The kind of struggling that gets noticed, that gets documented, that gets its own folder in a guidance counselor's office. Dyslexia for both of them. Slow processing speeds. The kind of learning profile that teachers either work with creatively or decide is someone else's problem. My parents decided it was someone else's problem. Specifically mine. My father, Gerald Whitlock, had built an entire identity around success. Around legacy. Around the Whitlock name landing with a certain weight in certain rooms. He had not built the company that bore his name. That was his mother's work, my grandmother Eleanor's life's labor, but he had run it for 20 years, and in that time he had convinced himself that the empire was his achievement, that the throne had always been his birthright, and that the only people who deserved to inherit what he had were the ones who looked like winners from the outside. Evan looked like a winner from the outside. My sister Charlotte's son. Perfect posture, perfect grades, perfect speech. He had won a national debate championship at 16, been featured in 3 different magazine profiles about exceptional young people, and received a full scholarship to Harvard before he had taken his senior portraits. My parents adored him. They kept a framed photo of his acceptance letter on the mantel in the living room. Not his diploma. His acceptance letter. As though the anticipation of his success was already worth celebrating. I did not dislike Evan. That matters. He was not a bad person. He was a young man who had been told his entire life that he was exceptional, and he had absorbed that belief the way children absorb everything completely, structurally, without question. He wasn't cruel to my sons. He mostly ignored them, which in some ways was worse. You can push back against cruelty. Invisibility just swallows you. The party was Charlotte's idea, but my parents funded it the way my parents funded everything they cared about, without restraint, without ceiling, with a particular kind of extravagance that wanted to be witnessed. The Plaza Hotel Ballroom. 300 guests. A string quartet in the corner playing something I recognized but couldn't name, the kind of music that signals to everyone in the room that money is present and would like you to notice. Champagne towers. Actual towers. I watched a server stack glasses into a pyramid and thought about all the grocery runs I had done on a budget, all the times I had told my boys we were having pasta again, because pasta was what we could afford that week, and I felt something close to fury move through me. Quiet and warm, the kind of fury you tuck back down because this is not the time, this is never the time, you just keep going. They seated us at table 26. I did not understand the significance until I looked around. Table 26 was near the kitchen doors. I could hear the clatter of dishes, the bark of orders, the rhythmic percussion of a working kitchen. We were close enough that servers brushed past us every few minutes, close enough that the ambient temperature was slightly wrong, close enough that when the speeches started, we were in the acoustical shadow of the room, where sound arrived muffled and slightly delayed. Leo noticed immediately. He has always had an engineer's sensitivity to the physical logic of spaces. "We're by the kitchen," he said. "I know," I said. "That's on purpose." I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. He already knew. Adrian was quieter. He had been quiet all evening. He had dressed carefully that night, a dark blazer over a white shirt, his hair pushed back, the mechanical watch Leo had rebuilt for him on his left wrist. He looked older than 18. He looked like someone who had already learned which battles weren't worth entering. They ate their appetizers. They didn't complain. They watched the room with the careful attention of people who have learned that watching is sometimes the only power available to them. My mother found us once, early in the evening. She was wearing a silk dress the color of champagne, and she had the bright, slightly artificial warmth she deployed at events, the warmth that said I am performing graciousness for an audience rather than I am actually glad to see you. She kissed my cheek. She looked at my sons. You boys look nice, she said, and then, before anyone could respond, her attention had already moved on, her eyes scanning the room for more important places to be. The inheritance announcement came after dinner. My father stood at the podium at the front of the ballroom, commanding the room the way he always had. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and the permanent expression of someone who expected agreement. He had the microphone. He had the room. He had 300 people who had eaten his food and drunk his champagne and were now in the warm, obliging mood of the well-fed. He cleared his throat. He smiled. Tonight, he said, we celebrate the future of the Whitlock family. Applause. Genuine, warm, the kind that fills a room and bounces off the high ceilings of a ballroom at the Plaza Hotel and makes you feel, briefly, that something genuinely wonderful is happening. He talked about legacy. He talked about what it meant to build something that outlasted you. He talked about his mother, my grandmother Eleanor, and how proud she would have been to see this night. He talked about Eleanor the way people talk about the dead when they are using them, fondly, selectively, mining memory for the version that best supports the present argument. Then he announced the inheritance. Evan would receive the Whitlock mansion. $13 million of Upper East Side real estate, 6 bedrooms, 3 floors, the kind of address that opens certain doors before you have even knocked. Evan would receive the Tesla. A detail that felt almost insulting in its smallness relative to everything else, but which was offered as though it were its own category of gift. Evan would receive controlling interest in Whitlock Investments. My father said this the way you say a thing that has already been decided. Not a proposal. Not a plan. A statement of existing reality. This is what will happen because I have determined it. The crowd accepted it in the same spirit, not with the scrutiny of people evaluating a decision, but with the approval of people ratifying something that had been true all along. I watched my twins during the announcement. Leo's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table. There was a tension in his hands, that same careful stillness he gets when he is working through something mechanical, when a part isn't fitting and he is deciding whether to force it or find a different approach. Adrian was watching my father. Not with anger. With the expression he gets when he is memorizing something. Filing it. Building the record. And then my mother leaned over. She didn't lower her voice. I don't think it occurred to her to lower her voice. She leaned slightly in the direction of my twins and she said, to no one in particular and therefore to everyone within earshot, some kids are born brilliant. A pause. A glance. And some are just slow. A small laugh rippled through the people nearest to us. Not everyone. Maybe 4 people. Maybe 5. But it was enough to be heard, and hearing it was enough to make it real. Leo looked up. He looked at my mother for a long moment. Then he looked back at his plate. Adrian didn't move at all. I was very still. I have learned to be still in these moments because the alternative, the shaking, the standing up, the saying what I actually think leads to being told I'm too sensitive, too dramatic, that it was just a joke, that I'm embarrassing everyone. That this is why we don't invite you to things. I was still. And then the stranger walked into the ballroom. I noticed him because he was wrong for the room. Not badly dressed, the gray suit was well cut, the silver hair barbered. But he carried himself with the deliberate stillness of someone who had arrived with a specific purpose and was not going to be distracted from it by the chandeliers, or the champagne towers, or the 300 people conducting the ongoing performance of a family at the height of its power. He stood near the entrance for a moment. Scanning. Then he started moving, and I realized he was moving toward us, and something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't immediately explain. He stopped at our table. He looked at me. Are you Miriam Whitlock? He asked. Quiet. Not a stage voice, not a party voice. A voice calibrated for a private conversation in a loud room. I said. I'm Miriam Calloway now. He nodded slightly as though he had expected this. As though the name change was already in his file. My name is Jonathan Hale, he said. I represented your grandmother Eleanor. The room seemed to get a little louder around me, or maybe I just became more aware of it, the way you become aware of your own heartbeat when something shifts. Eleanor has been gone for 3 years, I said. Yes, he said. She left instructions. Specific ones. About timing. He reached into his jacket and produced a sealed envelope. Cream-colored, thick. My name on the front in handwriting I recognized immediately because I had been looking at it my whole childhood on birthday cards and Christmas letters, and the occasional note slipped into my coat pocket when my parents weren't watching. Eleanor's handwriting. Strong and slanted and utterly her. She asked me to find you tonight, he said. Specifically tonight. She was very particular about that. Why tonight? He glanced briefly toward the front of the room, where my father was still holding court, where Evan was shaking hands with people who wanted proximity to the golden boy. Because this is the night it would matter most, he said. I looked at the envelope. I looked at my sons, who had gone very still in the way they go still when something important is happening and they are trying not to miss it. What's inside it? I asked. Jonathan Hale looked at me for a moment before he answered. The truth, he said, about who owns this family. We left before the cake. I didn't explain it to anyone. I put my hand on Leo's shoulder and tilted my head, and he stood immediately, and Adrian was already folding his napkin and pushing back his chair, and the 3 of us slipped out through the kitchen-adjacent corridor, the kitchen corridor, where they had seated us, which now felt less like an insult and more like a door, and into the lobby of the plaza, where the noise of the party became a murmur and I could hear myself think. I sat in one of the high-backed chairs near the window, and I looked at the envelope for a long moment. My son stood flanking me. Not hovering. Just present. I opened it. Inside was a letter in Eleanor's handwriting, dense and careful and exactly like her. And behind the letter, a document. Thick. Legal. Notarized on every page with the kind of thoroughness that communicates intent, the intent of a woman who knew that her wishes would be contested and had prepared accordingly. I read the letter first. Miriam, she had written. By the time you read this, you will have already heard your father announce what he believes to be the future. I need you to understand that he is wrong. Not because I do not love him, but because love without fairness is just favoritism, and I have watched favoritism destroy enough of this family already. Your sons are not slow. I need you to read that sentence twice. Your sons are not slow. They learn differently. They see differently. They think in patterns and systems and structures that traditional education is not built to recognize. I recognized it because I built a company on exactly that kind of thinking. The boys your parents dismiss are the boys I have been quietly teaching for 5 years. Every Sunday. Logic. Pattern recognition. Investment architecture. Business systems. The things that matter. I have left them the company, Miriam. The real company. Not the version your father has been running into acceptable mediocrity for 20 years. The actual majority. The 51% that has always been mine to give. But you have 48 hours from tonight to activate the trust. After that, the window closes forever. I am sorry I could not be there. I suspect the party is quite something. Love, Eleanor. I sat with that letter for a long moment. Leo was reading over my shoulder. He reads slowly, but he reads carefully, and I heard him exhale at the sentence about 5 years of Sunday lessons. She knew, he said quietly. She knew, I agreed. Adrian had taken the legal document and was going through it page by page with the careful, methodical attention he gives to anything numerical. He wasn't reading the words. He was reading the structure, the architecture of it. Tracing the logic from one clause to the next the way you trace a circuit to understand where the current runs. It's real, he said. He said it simply, without drama. As a statement of confirmed fact. The notarizations are right. The trust is structured correctly. She filed this with 3 separate witnesses. How do you know what correct looks like? I asked. He looked up at me. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had always seen it and never had a name for it. The expression of someone who has been told their whole life they aren't capable of something, and who has privately been mastering that thing for years, and who is now in the specific moment where the mastery becomes visible. "Grandma showed me," he said. Jonathan Hale met us in a cafe on 58th Street at 10 that night. He came with a leather briefcase and a second attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei who specialized in estate litigation and had the quiet, coiled energy of someone who had won difficult cases in difficult rooms. She shook our hands with a grip that communicated competence without performing it. They explained the structure of the trust. Eleanor had established it 7 years before her death, in a jurisdiction that my father had never thought to investigate because he had assumed, with the particular confidence of someone who has never been surprised, that he already knew everything important about his mother's finances. He had run Whitlock Investments for 2 decades. He had sat across from Eleanor in 100 board meetings. He had watched her age and slow and eventually, in her final year, withdraw from the company's daily operations. He had mistaken withdrawal for surrender. Eleanor had not surrendered. Eleanor had been building. The trust held 51% of Whitlock Investments. The beneficial interest was divided equally between Leo James Calloway and Adrian James Calloway, to be activated upon their reaching the age of majority, which both of them had now done, and upon the presentation of the founding document to the company's board within 48 hours of the trust's disclosure. The 48-hour clock had started at the moment Jonathan Hale handed me the envelope. "Why the time limit?" I asked. Patricia Osei folded her hands on the table. "Your grandmother was a strategic woman. She wanted the activation to happen under conditions of maximum clarity, meaning she wanted it to happen before your father had time to build a legal defense. 48 hours is enough time for you to act. It is not enough time for him to react effectively." Leo leaned forward. "What does he actually own?" "As of tonight, your father holds approximately 35% of Whitlock Investments. Your Aunt Charlotte holds 8%. The remaining 6% is distributed among minor shareholders." She paused. "None of them hold majority." Adrian said nothing. He was looking at a number he had written in the margin of a napkin. I recognized the expression. He was doing math. Then he put the pen down. "She planned this for a long time," he said. "She planned this for precisely the length of time it took to prepare you," Patricia said. 5 years of private instruction. 2 years of legal engineering. 3 years of waiting after her death for tonight's conditions to be met. My sons sat with that information. I watched them absorb it, not with the loud, expressive processing of people who perform their emotions, but with the quiet interior quality of people who go still when something large is entering them. They had been told they were slow for so long that the news of their own capacity arrived like a language they already spoke but had been forbidden to use. "What do we do next?" Leo asked. We walked into the Whitlock Investments boardroom at 9 in the morning, 46 hours after Jonathan Hale had found me in a hotel ballroom. I had called my father the night before. I had told him there was a legal matter requiring the board's presence. I had not told him what kind. His tone had been dismissive, then curious, then irritated in the particular way he gets when he suspects he is not in control of something. He was already there when we arrived. So was Charlotte. She was wearing a dark blazer and her expression was the careful neutrality of a woman who has learned to read rooms and is currently reading this one and not yet sure what it means. Evan was there too, sitting at the far end of the table with the slightly glazed look of someone who had been told to attend a meeting and did not yet understand why. He had his phone face down on the table in front of him, the gesture of someone making a show of paying attention. There were 6 board members. Senior people. People who had known Eleanor, who had run this company through market cycles and leadership changes and the particular turbulence of a family business navigating succession. They had the watchful quality of people who had seen things before and were now deciding whether this was one of those things. My father looked at my sons when we walked in. He looked at them the way he had always looked at them, with the particular expression of a man who sees something that does not fit his understanding of how things are ordered, and who resolves the dissonance by deciding the thing is simply wrong, simply misplaced, simply not worth the adjustment. He actually laughed. A short, incredulous exhale. He looked at Charlotte and then back at us. You brought them here, he said. To a board meeting? A small smile. Inviting agreement. This is a boardroom, Miriam. He stopped himself, but not because he had thought better of it. He stopped because he was calculating the optics. There were board members watching. There were witnesses. He recalibrated. What is this about, he said. Controlled now. The CEO voice. Jonathan Hale stepped forward. He placed the trust document on the table. He placed Eleanor's original will beside it. He placed a 3-page executive summary of the beneficial interests beside both of those. Then he looked at my father and said 4 words. Majority shareholders are present. The room absorbed this. My father looked at the documents. He picked up the trust agreement. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then stop, then go back to the beginning. The specific stillness of a man whose brain is receiving information that contradicts a foundational belief. This isn't, he started. It is, Patricia Osei said pleasantly. We had it independently verified yesterday. The trust is valid. The beneficial interests are confirmed. Leo and Adrian Calloway hold 51% of Whitlock Investments as of 18 hours ago. One of the board members, a woman named Ruth Hargrove, who had been with the company since Eleanor's time, leaned forward and picked up the document. She read carefully. She read the way lawyers read, or the way people who have dealt with lawyers read. Looking for the exits. Looking for the gaps. Finding none. She set it down. She looked at my sons. My sons looked back at her. You understand what this means? She asked them. Not condescendingly. Actually asking. We own the majority, Adrian said. Which means we hold the votes. Ruth Hargrove nodded once. My father stood up. This is absurd, he said. The CEO voice was gone. The controlled performance was gone. What was underneath it was what I had always known was underneath it, the particular fury of a man who has built his identity on being the most important person in the room and is now discovering the room has different information. They're children. They have no business experience. My mother was, she must have been. This document was signed under conditions that were not. Gerald. Patricia Osei's voice was quiet and precise. I would encourage you to be careful about the direction of this argument. The direction? The claim you appear to be building, she said, is that Eleanor Whitlock was mentally incapacitated when she established this trust. That is a serious legal claim. It is also a claim that, if pursued, would require an extensive examination of your mother's financial and business records over the past decade. A pause. All of them. Silence. My father was very still. Something moved across his face that I did not have a word for, not then. I have a word for it now. It was recognition. The specific, private recognition of a man who knows exactly which records would not survive examination. One of the other board members, a man named Douglas Park, who had joined the board 4 years ago and had the slightly detached air of someone who had been waiting for clarity about which way things were going, cleared his throat. Perhaps, he said, we should hear the full presentation. Jonathan Hale pressed play on a laptop connected to the boardroom speakers. My father's voice filled the room. I recognized the recording's texture immediately, the slightly flat quality of a conference room microphone, the ambient hum of a building's air filtration system. A board meeting. Years ago, by the sound of it. My father's voice, younger but unmistakable. I need the board to understand that my mother's voting power needs to be addressed. She is not operating at full capacity. Her judgment is compromised. If we allow her to continue making unilateral decisions about the company's direction, we are exposing ourselves to significant liability. I am proposing a formal review of her competency that would transfer operational and voting authority to. The recording stopped. The silence that followed was the particular kind that does not fade, the kind that settles, that takes up permanent residence in a room. Ruth Hargrove was looking at my father with an expression I could not fully read. Something between anger and grief. She had known Eleanor. She had been Eleanor's hire. Douglas Park had pushed his chair back slightly from the table, the physical equivalent of establishing distance. Charlotte's face was completely still. She was looking at the laptop. She was not looking at my father. I noted this. I noted it very carefully. My father opened his mouth. That recording is out of context, he said. There were concerns at the time that. Gerald. Ruth Hargrove's voice was flat. Not unkind. Just finished. Please stop. He stopped. She looked around the table. She looked at my sons, who were sitting quietly, hands folded, watching the room the way they had been watching rooms their whole lives, from the outside, from the corner, from table 26 near the kitchen. I think, Ruth said slowly, that the board has some business to attend to. The vote took 11 minutes. I counted. The motion was confidence in Gerald Whitlock as CEO of Whitlock Investments. Standard language. Standard procedure. 7 board members voted. 7 voted no confidence. My father sat through the count with the expression of a man watching an event he cannot stop and cannot reconcile with his understanding of how things work. The expression of someone for whom the world has just demonstrated that it was never actually organized the way he thought it was. After the count, no one spoke for a moment. Then my father stood up. He looked at my sons. I do not know what he saw in their faces. I do not know if he was looking for cruelty, for triumph, for the particular satisfaction of revenge delivered cleanly. If he was, he did not find it. My sons were not performing triumph. They were sitting quietly, and they were looking back at him, and there was something in their expressions that I recognized because I had seen it before. In the particular gravity of young people who have been through something difficult and have come out of it not with bitterness, but with a kind of careful, unfamiliar peace. My father left the room without speaking. Charlotte watched him go. She looked at me once, a look I could not entirely decode, something complicated, something that would take months and several conversations to unpack, and then she followed him. Evan remained. He looked at my sons for a long moment. I didn't know, he said. I know, Adrian said. About any of it. The seating. The things they said. I should have. Evan, Leo said. Not unkindly. It's okay. It was not entirely okay. These things are never entirely okay. But it was the beginning of something that might eventually become okay, and my sons, who had spent their entire lives being told they were not enough, extended that beginning with the casual generosity of people who have never confused winning with destruction. Ruth Hargrove asked the question after Evan had stepped out. She asked it directly, without preamble, looking at my sons with the attentive respect of someone who is trying to take the full measure of a person. What do you want to do with the company? There was a silence before Leo spoke. Not a hesitant silence. A considered one. The silence of someone who has already thought through this question, who has been thinking through it in some form since a grandmother handed them logic puzzles on Sunday mornings and watched how their minds moved. We don't want revenge, he said. Adrian completed the thought the way he has completed Leo's sentences his entire life, not because either of them is incomplete alone, but because they think in a kind of parallel that occasionally converges into something neither of them would arrive at alone. We want the company to be fair. Ruth Hargrove looked at them for a long moment. What does that mean to you? She asked. They had a presentation ready. They had prepared it in the 46 hours between Jonathan Hale handing me an envelope and walking into this boardroom. They had worked through the night, Leo at the whiteboard sketching systems and Adrian at the laptop running numbers. And I had sat in the corner of the hotel room we'd checked into and watched my sons work with the particular vertigo of a parent who has always known their children were capable of something and is finally, after 18 years, watching the world catch up to what she knew. The presentation was not polished. It was not the kind of thing that gets made by people who have been in boardrooms for decades, who have PowerPoint fluency and the specific rhetorical rhythms of corporate communications. It was handmade. It was dense with numbers and diagrams and the slightly irregular logic of people who think in systems rather than narratives. But it was right. I could see it in the way the remaining board members leaned forward as Adrian walked through the financial structure. The company had been well managed in some respects. My father was not incompetent, exactly, but it had been managed conservatively, protectively, with the orientation of a man whose primary goal was preservation of existing value rather than generation of new value. It had been managed, in other words, by someone who was afraid of losing what he had rather than excited about building what he didn't. Eleanor had seen a different kind of potential. The innovation division was Adrian's idea. A dedicated structure within the company for identifying and investing in pattern disruption opportunities, the kind of investment thesis that requires systems thinking. That requires the ability to see the architecture beneath an industry and identify where the load-bearing walls actually are. It required exactly the kind of intelligence my parents had spent 18 years dismissing. Leo presented the operational component, how the division would be staffed by people with proven domain expertise, how decisions would run through a structured process, how the shareholders would guide strategic direction without micromanaging execution. He drew diagrams on a legal pad as he spoke. Actual diagrams. Detailed, precise, annotated. Douglas Park, who had been the most neutral board member throughout the morning, made a note on his own pad and then looked up. "Where did you learn to think about investment architecture this way?" he asked Adrian. Adrian paused. "My grandmother," he said. And something moved through that room then, something I can't entirely name, some mixture of belated reckoning and earned grief and the particular, complicated feeling of understanding something too late to thank the person who taught it to you. Eleanor had died knowing she had done this work. She had died without knowing if it would land. She had trusted the mechanism she built, the trust, the timing, the 48-hour window, the lawyer who would find us at exactly the right moment. She had trusted all of it to carry her investment in these boys to the moment when it could be seen. It had been seen. Ruth Hargrove looked at my sons for a long time after the presentation ended. "Eleanor would have liked this," she said finally. "She planned it," Adrian said. "Yes," Ruth said. "She did." 6 months later, Whitlock Investments opened its innovation division with a press announcement that led with the phrase guided by its youngest shareholders. The financial press covered it with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity that new things tend to attract. Several profiles were written. Several of those profiles mentioned the shareholders' ages and their backgrounds, and the dyslexia, and the learning profiles, and the private Sunday lessons. And the grandmother who had spent 5 years preparing 2 boys for a moment that most of the world had assumed would go to someone else. The profiles did not use the phrase "dumb ones." My sons declined all interview requests. They were not interested in being a story. They were interested in the company. The innovation division made its first investment 8 months in a small logistics startup that had developed a pattern recognition system for supply chain optimization. The kind of thing that looks like nothing until it looks like everything. Leo had identified it. Adrian had structured the terms. The startup tripled in value inside a year. My parents tried to apologize. It happened in stages, the way apologies from people who have never had to apologize genuinely do. First, there was the call from my mother, careful, hedging, full of the kind of language that is technically an apology, but is actually a renegotiation of terms. We never meant it the way it sounded. "You know how your father is." It was a different time. I listened to her all the way through. Then I said, "I know you're sorry. I believe you're sorry." A pause. But my sons spent 18 years being told they weren't enough by the people who were supposed to love them most. That doesn't unhappen because the situation changed. My mother was quiet. "They're extraordinary," I said. They were always extraordinary. The only thing that changed is that the room finally got quiet enough to hear it. She didn't have an answer for that. My father's apology came through an intermediary, a letter drafted with a lawyer's care, full of the strategic language of a man trying to minimize liability even in contrition. He acknowledged that his words had been harmful. He acknowledged that he had underestimated his grandsons. He did not acknowledge the recording, but then I hadn't expected him to. Leo read the letter. "Set it down." "He wrote that himself?" he asked. "With help," I said. He considered this. "He still doesn't actually understand," he said. "Not as an accusation. As an observation. The calm, specific observation of a young man who has arrived at a place his grandfather has not." "No," I agreed. "He doesn't." "That's sad," Adrian said. And it was. That was the thing I had not fully understood until I watched my sons sit across from their grandfather's letter with nothing in their faces but a kind of patient, clear-eyed sadness. There is no triumph in being right about someone's capacity for growth. There is only the specific grief of watching a person stay small when the world offered them the chance to expand. My father stayed small. My sons did not wait for him. I think about Eleanor a great deal now. I think about the version of her I knew, The grandmother with the strong handwriting and the sharp eyes, and the slightly formal warmth of a woman who had built something real and was proud of it without being showy about the pride. I think about the Sunday mornings I didn't know about, the sessions in Eleanor's study with two boys who couldn't read at grade level and could build investment frameworks from scratch. I think about the patience that required, the vision. She saw something in my sons that their own grandparents, her own son, refused to see. She did not argue about it. She did not try to convince anyone. She simply taught. She simply prepared. She built the mechanism, she set the timer, and she trusted that 18 years of quiet investment would produce exactly what it produced. This is what I want you to understand if you are reading this, because your family has a table 26. If someone has decided, without evidence, without patience, without the willingness to look at you honestly, if someone has decided that you are the slow one, the dumb one, the lesser version of the people they actually believe in, I want you to understand that their assessment is not a fact. It is a limit. Theirs, not yours. The people who dismiss you most confidently are often the people most invested in not understanding you. Because understanding you would require them to revise their map, to admit that their categories are wrong, to sit with the discomfort of having been mistaken about something they declared certain. Most people will not do that voluntarily. They will need to be shown. My sons did not force anyone to see them. They did not argue, or perform, or campaign for recognition. They learned. They prepared. They waited for the moment when the room went quiet and the documents landed on the table and the facts became undeniable. That is the thing about the truth of someone's capacity. You cannot kill it with neglect. You cannot reduce it with mockery. You cannot redirect its inheritance to someone more convenient and expect it to simply cease to exist. Eleanor knew this. My sons knew this. The boardroom knew this, eventually, at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday when a lawyer placed a document on a table and said 4 words, and a room full of powerful people understood, perhaps for the first time, that they had been looking at the wrong people all along. Slow readers. Systems thinkers. Boys who took apart watches and rebuilt them from memory. Boys who memorized every number they ever heard. Boys who had been seated at table 26 their entire lives, close enough to the kitchen to hear the work happening, far enough from the center to be invisible. Majority shareholders. The ones who quietly prepared while everyone else was busy celebrating someone else. The ones who didn't want revenge. Just fairness. Which, in the end, was the most powerful thing anyone in that room could have said.